I'm glad to see everybody here. Thank you for joining me. I'm happy to be here. I hope you'll learn something here this afternoon. So let's get started and start talking about application gateway security. But first, I'm Matthew Close. And before we really get started, just a quick introduction to tell you a little bit more about myself and my background. I'm a 24-year career security professional. Today, I'm the primary security advisor at Doherty Business Solutions, a consulting firm with offices around the country. On the personal side, I'm from the Dallas-Fort Worth area, so I work remotely just like all of us these days, except I've been working remotely for the last 18 years or so. I'm also a dad who loves to cook, watches YouTube, and when I have some spare time, which isn't very often, brews beer. All right, so what are we going to be covering today? Let me start by saying right off the bat, this isn't going to be a super technical talk. Today is more of a discussion about a mindset, and I'm going to try and help you see how combining your technical expertise and some basic common sense strategies can help foster more security-first mindsets when it comes to your application that hopefully pays off. We'll start with defining application gateway security and where it comes into play. Some of you may think you know what this is and what it entails, and maybe you've got an idea, but I'm going to clarify a few things, particularly related to terminology. Next, we'll talk about the basic division between security and development teams, who's usually in charge of application gateway security, what's involved in the process of implementing it, where you, the developer, fit in, and how all of this can create a disconnect. Next, I'll briefly outline how that disconnect creates troubles and what's the risk involved with that. Then, of course, we'll look at what you, in conjunction with the security team, can do to fix those problems. I'm going to offer a straightforward three-step strategy, it's common sense really, that can help you start prioritizing earlier in your development process to avoid issues at the application gateway. Finally, I'll give you just a few examples of how you might put that strategy into practice. So let's get started. So what is application gateway security? Application gateway security, as we'll talk about here, is a proxy that handles the connections between your users and your actual application while protecting your APIs and infrastructure from hacking. And it can come in many forms. I know a lot of people might think, wait, isn't this a web application firewall? Not exactly, and I'll explain why on the next slide. But I like this snippet from a book on mod security, which we'll talk about shortly, because it reminds us that rather than focus on the name, you should focus on what a particular tool does and how it can help. Let's do a quick overview of application gateway security. Why is it there? This type of proxy exists primarily for the purpose of weeding out potential risks to your application. What are those risks? It can protect you from things such as SQL injection, cross-site request forgery, cross-site scripting, etc. We'll get into a couple of detailed examples later on regarding those types of attacks and how they might play out in your environment. So what makes this particular proxy different? You may think app gateway or reverse proxy or WAF or load balancer, or possibly all of them. There is sometimes not a whole lot of difference between a WAF and an application gateway. But I like using the name application gateway to indicate this is part of the network and it's much more tightly tied to your application. An application gateway works best when it has more information about as much information about your application as possible. Whatever you call it, though, WAF or application gateway, this piece of network gear will probably interact more closely with your application than anything else other than your app itself. And that's why I've leaned more toward using the name application gateway. So how does this proxy determine risk? By working at the layer 7, the application layer, and examining traffic to your apps and your API endpoints. It examines gets, puts, posts, etc. Are endpoint types valid? Are they numeric, alphanumeric? It looks at MIME types. What else might this particular proxy do, and when might that happen? So it can be a number of different other things like we've already talked about. It can be responsible for SSL termination, URL rewrites, load balancing, adding security headers, And as an aside, SSL termination is a big topic for a lot of people with the application gateway. So for many situations, the SSL session will terminate there at the gateway and traffic will pass unencrypted to your endpoints. This will take some amount of encryption overhead off your app's environment. And while this is pretty common that I've seen in a lot of places, caution should be noted that it's not appropriate for all kinds of traffic, especially not something like PII. And in those situations, you should probably consider encrypting end-to-end. So where does application gateway security come into play? And where do you, the developer, fit in? So let's cover some app gateway basics. So where it sits. Typically, the application gateway is a perimeter network device, but should not be confused with a firewall. And it's not always here. There are plenty of other places you can insert this type of proxy as well. So why? So why is it different from a firewall? Often a firewall limits the types of network traffic by, let's say, port filtering, and it will be at the front door of your environment and weed out traffic destined for your environment before the application gateway ever sees it. And I would suggest, and probably in most situations, the application gateway will not be at the front of everything else. It's usually a pretty poor idea to do that. What it does, so it enforces security policies. And how does it do that? So through a variety of different policies, and they can take some different forms. So there's regex rules, endpoint rules, and there's some header modification rules. It doesn't always end there, and there can be other varieties. So there's also something called virtual patching that you should be familiar with. And essentially, this is and it's also referred to as patch in line. And essentially, this is using the application gateway and a targeted rule to protect your application from a vulnerability, or a CVE. However, don't rely on this fully. We'll come back to that briefly as to why later. So who's in charge of it? And I would say almost always it'll be a security team. But does that really make sense for you? So let's figure that out. So if security is in charge of the application gateway, how do they go about creating those policies? It's a process called tuning. It's straightforward, but it's difficult and it can take a long time. This is how security determines the rules that will allow traffic to pass through the application gateway. Their goal is to only allow what is absolutely necessary, then block everything else. When tuning, in addition to several other things, security will usually look at two types of rule sets. First, there's the general rule set that's already written and they have ready access to. And second, and this is the important one, rules they need your help with, like the ones you write for your API endpoints. As far as general rules go, we're mainly talking about the OWASP Mod Security Core Rule Set, otherwise just called the CRS. So OWASP stands for the Open Web Application Security Project. They have an amazing array of tools, resources, and cheat sheets about how common vulnerabilities work. Great resource if you've run across it in the past. Most likely, everyone here has already heard of the OWASP Top 10. So the top 10 are 10 things that the OWASP Mod Security Core Rule Set provides protection for. That includes things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, Java code injection, like our current evil friends, Spring4Shell and Log4j exploits, bot detection, etc. But just a note, the maintainers of the rules say, and I'm quoting here, the CRS aims to protect web applications from a wide range of attacks, including the OWASP Top 10, with a minimum of false alerts. And we'll come back to this last part, minimum of false alerts, really soon. So, as far as the rules they need help with go, these are the API endpoint rules. So it uses a similar regex format, and it's the policy that will be tuned to expected data types and HTTP methods. And because security doesn't have access to these rules offhand, they should come to each of the development teams and request an inventory of endpoints, the HTTP method, and expected inputs. So security knowledge of some of the necessary rules. So security has knowledge of some of the necessary rules to tune the policy, and they help setting the others. They need help setting the others, so they look to the developers. Makes sense, but development teams often don't have a complete and accurate picture of all the endpoints with large apps. Even with tools like Swagger in place, it's hard to get a detailed view like security is going to need. Okay, so if it's such a problem, why not just delegate creation of the policies to the dev teams? It would be nice, but most organizations aren't built that way. There are checks and balances, accountability and change management usually at play, and everybody has to deal with compliance issues, of course. And basically, we just can't put one group in charge of everything. There's too much going on, too much knowledge involved, and too much at stake. So where does that leave us? So herein lies the problem. If we can't put one group in charge, but both of the involved groups don't have all the information they need, then security and development must work together to get this right. Yet, as you likely know, they don't often do this. And you know this because in the event of a problem with application security, developers don't really hear about it until it's too late and something is just deemed broken. So this disconnect is real. Too often, the needs and parameters of security policies aren't communicated to the development teams, so applications are often written with insufficiently defined input, or vice versa. This is a two-way street. And when security and development teams both operate with insufficient information, problems are going to arise. These are real problems that cause major issues for applications, for teams, and for businesses at large. So let's look at a couple of examples. So when parameters cause problems. So the example, my team has implemented a new online chat function that works great in all the tests. Suddenly in production, users are complaining that some messages never send. Enter insufficient character set definitions. The culprit turns out to be special characters that weren't anticipated or weren't communicated to security. So where did it go wrong? Again, a good application gateway security policy is narrowly defined in what it permits. So security maybe thinks of it like this. The development team said this new feature would be chat. So ta-da, let's say it's a post with a message, with a sender ID and a recipient ID in the URL to some endpoint. The problem is no one bothered to say anything about the characters your chat features use to the security team. So security being who they are, just assumed ASCII. So the parameters of the policies were set to block all non-ASCII content. Bottom line, the security team didn't know what to expect because no one told them. So, and the problems don't end there for the application gateway policy. What else weren't they told? How long is a chat post supposed to be? Can you send JPEGs? Can you delete chat messages? And I hope you mentioned all of these requirements to security. I'm betting their picture is nowhere near what you had in mind. Another common one, false positive. So this is when legitimate traffic gets incorrectly flagged and blocked. So an example, again, is my team released an application that, as part of its functionality, allows a user to input a query string that contains HTML tags, for good or bad. Unfortunately, while the server can securely handle this type of request, the application gateway was configured using the OWASP CRS, and that will block this request and identify it as cross-site scripting. So where did it go wrong? In my experience, false positives usually happen because security enters the picture too late in the game. In other words, security wasn't a priority. I like to say safety first to my son before he starts to mow the lawn. And I hand him some safety glasses. I also like to joke, safety second when he forgets, and I hand him the safety glasses. But it's the same here, security first, not security second. So when should a security policy start to come into the mix, come into this example? If you answered production, you have my deepest sympathies. That's way too late. The answer is as early as possible. So why? Let's say you normally do your day-to-day dev on your laptop. That's probably an open environment where communication between services within your app's API and your browser are pretty unencumbered by security measures. Next, after your laptop, in your development pipeline, you move to a shared dev environment, to QA. Maybe it goes to pre-prod for a bit and finally production. If you wait till production to divulge specific input requirements, all your work testing in pre-prod could be for nothing because the production environment and its application gateway security policy won't match your pre-prod environment. Bottom line, the sooner your pipeline security measures matches that of production, the more prepared security will be to meet your app's needs, and the more prepared you will be to fix those false positives before they cause an outage in production. So how do we fix this? How can security and development teams come together to avoid these pitfalls? So I'm proposing a three-part strategy that bridges this divide. The idea is that many issues can be prevented if developers and security teams gain a better understanding of what the other is doing with respect to the application, and then agree to establish a better relationship with defined roles to proactively prevent potential security risks. And this is for the mutual benefit of both teams. The goal here is to establish an iterative process for application gateway security that makes things easier, faster, and more efficient for everyone. The iterative process involves 3 steps: assess, collaborate to learn, and evolve. So let's take a look at each of these elements a little closer. So the first phase is assess. Might seem a little counterintuitive to start when there's already a problem, but the reality is that's almost always the catalyst for wanting to change. And the good news is that we're dealing with an iterative cycle, so starting with a problem can still lead you to eliminating that same problem in the future. So it's still proactive, even when it's retrospective. And we don't want this to feel demanding for anyone. We don't have time for that. The point is, start somewhere. So there are problems in production, and it's all hands on deck. How can security and dev teams work together in a crisis? First step, assess the situation from both sides. How? So don't panic. Seriously, breathe. Rash, on-the-fly type changes don't always go well. I know this from the network and security side of things. I've worked on these situations in the past, and people were so overrun by what was happening that they made snap decisions that wasted time and caused more problems. I called it the sky is falling syndrome. Rest assured, the sky is not falling. So, easily enough, use your tools. You're figuring out what happened. Logs from the application gateway should be a given. Try to correlate those logs with what broke in your app. You should be able to work with security to see where the break has occurred. Trust what you know, and I kind of stress this very seriously. Don't go digging into logs you've never looked at before. Those unfamiliar logs, though probably normal, in your panic mode will look like everything is wrong. Communicate what you're doing, what you find, and don't assume security is working on a particular task. Likewise, security shouldn't assume you are working a miracle in the code. You know what they say about assumptions, communicate what's going on, and request that security do the same. And last, avoid finger pointing. This means both during the event and after. It's tempting to roll eyes and say it's so-and-so's team, but this isn't about blame. It's about finding a solution and preventing the issues from happening again. Who's at fault is of no consequence in the moment, nor is it likely to be your job to play detective. All right, so the next phase in the strategy is collaborate to learn. What is the fix? The hope is once you know where the problem exists, you have a clear picture of the course in front of you to fix things. Was it traffic being blocked by the application gateway? Then the fix was probably an exception policy of some form by the security team. If they haven't come back to you to explain their fix, ask them to. They owe it to you so you can anticipate in the future. Who has what responsibility related to the fix? Be sure to delegate. Open those issues, ticket stories with the right team and get them assigned. Common sense, right? Well, not always. At very large companies, finding the right team isn't always easy. It gets even worse if different teams use different issue tracking tools. How will the fix be communicated to both security and dev so that it's functional and documented? So issue tracking tools help you get the work finished, but can also act as the document to resolution. Use these tools to help future you remember what you did to fix this type of problem. This is especially important on the vulnerabilities security might bring to you. So, and another quick example here is, If you're working to address an issue in a vulnerability report or a pen test report, include the report document or the link to it in every single ticket or issue that gets opened. And this is real world for me. I've encountered this many times over the years. Let's say 15 vulnerabilities came in and 15 issues were open, but only the very first one got the vulnerability report. It's a nightmare to have that report, not to have that report in each issue, especially for some of those hard to get rid of problems that stick around for 6 or 12 months. Good luck finding the original security report 12 months later when you finally have an opportunity to fix that low severity issue in the backlog. What did we learn? It's essential to have a postmortem on all big security events. The postmortem should ask, could this have been avoided? Would some changes in coding best practices have addressed some aspect of the vulnerability in the first place? Or it could be that security didn't anticipate the magnitude of the changes that were being released and overlooked application gateway policies that needed more testing. Remember, this is not a blame session. It's all about doing better next time, which leads us to the last step in the process. The final phase of the strategy is evolve. Because this is an iterative process, you learn from each go-round how to do better and become better to avoid similar situations in the future. That requires that you do a lot of communicating and advanced planning in order to evolve. At this stage, you finish the security postmortem. You're armed with the details of what went wrong and how it was fixed. Now, apply that and change how things work. As our friend here says, this is the way. What should be shared with security? This is not an exhaustive list, but just some things to keep in mind. Endpoint inventories. Sure, the security team can get this from the logs. It's not easy, but it's possible. However, what about that endpoint that was left on but should be deprecated now? Security doesn't know about that, and they won't know it's off by the logs. How about that dark launch coming up that's never been in production? Security can't find those URLs in the logs at all. And if the security team doesn't know about it, it's probably never been configured on their application gateway. Second, known security issues in your code or libraries you use. So as a security professional, I try to stay on top of security news and releases of zero-day problems. However, if you as a developer notice a published vulnerability on one of the libraries you use, let the security team know. Don't assume they already know. It's very possible they can work with you and ensure the application gateway is blocking malicious traffic that targets the vulnerability. And if they can't, and this is important, that helps you, the developer, set a higher priority on getting that update fixed sooner rather than later. Adds, deletes. If you want a new endpoint to work with your app, you must let the security team know if you expect it to work properly. And just as important, when something is deprecated, that configuration in the application gateway needs to be removed as well. And API versions. If you want a new endpoint to work with your app, you must let the security, what's the version of your API in use and how's the gateway enforce a different policy, or can it? API versioning always seems like a rat hole, but whatever type of versioning you use, make sure the security team understands what is current and what is on the way out. How should you communicate these things? First of all, be specific. Security people are not mind readers. If a chat message is, as we already said, an alphanumeric string with some punctuation to you, don't leave it up for doubt. Provide a regex that'd match any chat you'd ever expect. Or, like we've discussed, say it'll be UTF-8 and move on. They'll know how to make a wider exception list. Within my security world, there is a philosophy of least privilege. Or put another way, any security policy must define exactly what you would expect to see allowed on your network and block everything else. That's my view as a security professional. So if you, as the developer, don't tell me the specifics of what the expected traffic to your application looks like, it's likely to get blocked at some point, if not right from the start. Be interested. I've asked developers a lot of dumb coding questions, well, probably for this crowd, sure. But I don't mind if they're dumb because showing interest always helps level the playing field. I got a lot of laughs when I did pair programming, but I still learn from it. Feel free to ask a security-related question yourself. It quickly gets rid of the tension that developers don't understand networks and security doesn't understand code. The standard banter of security and development isn't healthy. It's BS that we've all probably encountered. It doesn't help anyone. It's a trap. Don't fall back into that attitude. And if you still encounter that situation, call it out. People can't learn if they feel belittled when they ask questions. So if that's the kind of attitude you get from security, bring it up. Log properly. And yes, in this sense, that's a form of communication here. How should you log? Sending PII to the log store probably is not a good idea long term, if ever. So how much should you log? I've seen too many situations where debug type logs are done as standard. A flood of logs when you're trying to diagnose problems can bury the true origins of a problem. Even worse, understand the impact of logging too much. Excess logging impacts performance, can result in denied connections, fill up storage needlessly. So when will this be important again? Check your timelines. This is probably the one I hear about most. Security is the department of no. Everything with them adds X number of hours, days, weeks to any release. Let's avoid them. I get it, we're all overworked. I'm not here to make excuses for security often being a roadblock and a release schedule nightmare. But if you've done a good job defining your API and are about to change those ID formats that you agreed would always be 12 digits long, you might want to tell security now that you'll need some policy updates at the application gateway level. And what about your pipeline environments? Are they consistent? Ask your security team this, how they keep it consistent from environment to environment. Hopefully they also have some automation in place to keep their policies in sync with your code promotions. If you have a regular release schedule, please share it with the security team. Obviously, that helps ensure the code and the application gateway can be ready to make it to production at the very same time. Finally, who will play a role? Define who does what. Security will often be in charge of DNS, routing, firewalls, load balancers, and the application gateway, for example. You obviously implement your app's features and maintain the code, but possibly roles change with environment. Dev, QA, pre-prod to prod, maybe up to pre-prod. The dev teams maintain the DNS, but in pre-prod and prod, it's handed over to security. Point being, make sure that's written down somewhere and make sure that people referred to know their roles. And then provide all the informed teams with checklists of application needs usage. More and more, I see security getting involved with Jenkins pipelines, and this was supposed to be your tool, right? I can assure you it's not security trying to make your life difficult by inserting themselves into Gates and Jenkins. It really does help ensure secure code gets released. And if the security team is doing it right, they will have built automation tools that work with Jenkins to promote application gateway changes along with your code. The end result, over iterations and over time working this process, will be more security-first mindset and development approach. Now let's take a look at how this might play out in a few real-world scenarios. So the first example, major release, new features. So let's look at this strategy and apply it as I just described. So step one, assess. So what's the situation? You've just released an update with new features and encountered the dreaded it doesn't work in production situation. It always seems this way. Every time, everything tests fine through the pipeline and promotion production fails. Time to blame security, right? Remember the steps though. Don't panic, use your tools, communicate, avoid finger pointing. Take a beat. Okay, so let's take a calmer approach. What actually works and what doesn't? Are connections not making it all the way through? Are some users' connections working and some are not? Next, use your tools. Usefulness of logs can't be overstressed when it comes to assessing problems. But how do you compare thousands of lines of logs when they vary so much from line to line? Depending on how you store your logs, running filters to make log lines comparable can be really helpful. For example, remove the variables like digits, names, dates, timestamps, whatever, from each log line, and then compare what's left over. And again, don't blame. Assigning blame either publicly or within a group isn't going to help. It'll break down trust in the long run. And offhand, I told you so during a release at 1 a.m. does no one any good. Even if it was the application gateway and its super restrictive policy, let it go. Because I can tell you, someone on the security team is thinking, if someone had just told us XYZ was going to change, we would have fixed the policy before all this even got started. Step 2, collaborate to learn. Once you know what is and is not working, it's time to get the fix in production. In motion. If someone is making a change, announce it. That way people know if they need to re-examine things they've already looked at or continue as is. It's not fun to be problem solving in a release, only later to have it mysteriously start working because someone made a change to the application gateway policy that suddenly allowed the traffic that was being blocked. Don't forget to document. If it was something as small as acceptable characters being blocked, ensure that becomes part of the specs of the app in the future. Then get that postmortem in action. Make sure all the teams that need to be involved to resolve are present and participating. Obviously within your group, but also with the security team. Talk about what happened without blame. Step 3, it's time to evolve. Okay, so things didn't go perfectly. That's okay. You tackled the problems at hand. Going forward, if you do large calls for releases to ensure people know what's going on, make sure security gets the invite. They are going to be looking at logs you probably aren't. They have their own set of worries and ways of approaching problems. Maybe they spot a policy change on the application gateway that was promoted incorrectly. Maybe they spot a regex that's getting a little too greedy in what it's matching and denying it. If they are with you on the release calls, they might be able to make on-the-fly changes to resolve the problem. And as an aside, having been the person making those changes, it's no less harrowing than making hot fixes to code. Mistakes will be made. I know, I've made some in the heat of the moment. Do the information exchange. Do you have a release calendar that you've shared with outside groups, security in particular? If you don't have a release calendar, make one and share it. Prepare your timeline to include steps to check for the issues that just came up. Learn from what happened and keep security informed about potential changes. All right, next example, the pen test. So let's start again. First step, assess. So what's the situation? Your application just was undergoing a security scan and pen test by a third party, and the results are in. There are a bunch of low security items, but there are also a couple critical OWASP top 10 ugly security vulnerabilities that need to be fixed now. What are you going to do? Same steps. Don't panic, use your tools, communicate, avoid finger pointing. Okay, so we'll remain calm while we figure out what happened. And this might be really tough on some of the worst findings. So what portion of your code was responsible for the feature that is vulnerable? Do you understand what the vulnerability means? Not all security problems are reported to you in a developer-friendly sort of way. Take, for example, a critical item like site search function has SSRF exposure. And just so you know, that's server-side request forgery. And that might be totally opaque to you. If that's the case, get someone from security to cover some examples with you. Ask them some questions. Learn how it works. They'll be happy to explain. Now use your tools. You got a vulnerability report, right? Did the report provide evidence of how this particular feature can be exploited? You should also have tools in place to replicate these vulnerabilities. This is where I, as the security person, would typically come in to make sure you have such tools. For browser-based attacks, you probably already have the tools with a few exceptions. If you work on mobile apps, you might not. The tools here will often be rooted or jailbroken phones of various makes. Or, at the bare minimum, phones with special settings on them to work properly with tools like an intercepting proxy. Do you have any agreed upon vulnerability remediation guides with the security team? If so, stick to them. Notify people about priorities and how a security fix might override currently scheduled work. And always avoid finger pointing. Security vulnerabilities in particular tend to send people on a hunt with pitchforks and torches. Avoid that altogether. Having someone find a severe security issue with your app in the first place is enough guilt. Don't pile on the blame. If the vulnerability is a problem because security doesn't release OS patches quickly enough, this is no time to hold that over them. Work out the details with them. Maybe they don't patch as often as they like either because it disrupts your release cycles. Second, collaborate to learn. It's here the application gateway can save your bacon. With problems like log4j, Spring4Shell, SQL injection, and cross-site scripting, it's quite possible that the application gateway will be able to solve some of these problems and reduce the number of managers screaming, "Fix this now." This also works for security issues that often come up on scans like mixed content, cookies missing the secure flag, etc., all header-based stuff. The application gateway can virtually patch the vulnerability when it examines all the traffic destined to your app by filtering out the exploit traffic. Some caution should be used when taking this route, and we'll come back to that in the end. Once the fix is deployed in the test environment, let the security team know. It's very likely they will be able to use the pen test results to test your fix. And as a side note here, along with the evidence of the vulnerability, most pen tests will include steps to reproduce the vulnerability. Special security tools are often required to do this. So work with the security team to understand how they will reproduce the problem and test your fix. For example, developers have Postman for a lot of testing. I use 3 pretty similar tools to interact with the APIs. One's called MITM, or Man in the Middle, Burp Suite, and possibly surprising, curl. And I use all 3 of those to reproduce vulnerabilities that I've been notified about. Document what's been done. Whatever tool you use to track work, use it for documenting the security fixes. It'll come in handy in the future when someone else has to deal with the exact same issue. From the security side of things, I'll often be gathering evidence the problem is fixed for compliance reasons. And I would strongly encourage both the security people and the developers to make sure the evidence for the fix makes it back into the documentation. All right, then it's time for the post-mortem collaboration. Again, it's vitally important to make sure everyone is there. Maybe everything was addressed with a code change. However, still, please do get security in the room. And again, exchange information with security about what was needed to fix things and how it happened. That information allows me, the security guy, to go back through the rest of the code and see if the same thing could happen with other endpoints the pen testers didn't catch. Security should know how they were able to reproduce the vulnerability as well, which I think can be really pretty instructive to you, the developer, and might prevent future risks in the app. Finally, evolve. Security vulnerabilities are never going away. However, after fixing these critical issues, can you change your best practices in some way to accommodate a more security-first approach? You don't have to come with all of these. Invite the security team to give you input. Was that critical vulnerability really critical? Maybe you, in conjunction with the security team, come up with a consistent way to score vulnerabilities. I've seen many remote code execution, RCE, one of the worst, situations have requirements that would never be possible in the live environment I'm working in. But all those RCE items will get tagged as critical. If the security and development teams work together on the scoring methods used, often they can come to a same conclusion about how to handle the latest threats. But a cautionary tale here for everyone. So we've talked about how the application gateway can solve a lot of security headaches, and security headers, patch and line, protect you from large classes of security vulnerabilities, and be fine-tuned to allow just the traffic you expect for your app and nothing more. However, you can't rely on the application gateway for everything. Now, no security tool is foolproof or unhackable. And here's some quick examples. It's possible to ID or fingerprint the type of rule set on your application gateway. Many applications leak clues as to what platforms they are running on or what libraries they might use. Similarly, the way an application gateway behaves under controlled conditions can be used to identify what vendor or rule sets are in place. Application gateway bypasses are very possible and do happen. It often comes down to novel encoding of malicious traffic, so it slips by the powerful regex filters on the gateway and gets successfully forwarded to your application. In fact, one such situation recently came up with Spring4Shell. The Java code injection section of the CRS, originally thought to mitigate the attacks, was found to have some possible evasions and required an update. The ability to bypass security policies on the application gateway is why virtual patching, which I mentioned earlier, shouldn't be relied on for long periods of time. It's a great solution for a little while, but expect it to be bypassed at some point in the future. Even with security expertise, it's still easy to misconfigure the application gateway. It's easy to be so focused on the core rule set and exceptions to overlook adding back simple things like trusted X-forwarded for headers. Suddenly, you're scratching your head wondering why you have all the app traffic coming from localhost or Docker's default subnet. When it comes to security scans and pen tests, and this is a very important one, don't scan or test through the application gateway. By this, I mean the developers and the security team should work to understand the true state of your app's security. And that needs to be done without many of the network defenses in place, particularly not the application gateway. So consider whitelisting external scanning services and third-party pen testers to bypass your application gateway security policy, but please be careful if you have these exceptions in place in production. Bottom line, make well thought out accommodations so the real picture of your app can be assessed without the application gateway impacting the results. And as always, the best practice is to still patch and fix and secure code in a timely fashion. It's boring, but best practices aren't usually exciting. All right, so what did we learn? You now know why application gateway security matters, both to the security people and to the developers. You have a framework for how these teams can and should work together to identify and hopefully prevent issues that cost time, effort, money, reputation, and more. But don't let it end there. Consider expanding this new relationship with security. Application gateways aren't the only things the security and development teams have to talk about. Your security people are a great resource for other technology that you'll likely have, you'll enjoy having their experience for. Things like DNS, routing, all things network, pen testing, scanning, SSL certs, etc. And that's it. We might have used up all the time with the technical difficulties earlier, but hopefully this has been useful. If you have any questions, feel free to ask here, or you can reach out to me by email or LinkedIn. And if I went too quickly through anything and you'd like to see some notes, please just send me an email. And with that, thanks for your time. Hope you enjoyed it.
So,
yeah.
Question: based on your experience, have you, when you're consulting with all these companies and looking at these companies have API programs, obviously they use gateways, etc. Have you come across companies that have like an API center of excellence or a guild, etc.? And what are your thoughts on that sort of model?
Yeah, I think definitely having a center of excellence is a great way to do things. It gets people together that have common interests, and is a fantastic opportunity for developers to talk about how what their architecture and design looks in front of security people. And it's in a useful, and that's a great way to exchange that information to the security team, and let them ask you questions and allow you to ask them questions as well. So I think any time when you can get together and have security folks in the room with developers, it's important. It fosters a good relationship, because I know in places I've worked in the past, it can be somewhat antagonistic, and I'm trying to get rid of that.
What about, and I follow up, thank you for your
Yeah,
time.
of course.
And a follow-up is, so let's say you have an organization where, you have a security team, application, AppSec, etc.
Yeah.
And we say, hey, let's shift things left, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Let's embed those folks, let's break it apart and make the security team now, every application or product team now own security. Your thoughts?
So I think to some extent, if you have expertise within those teams, like sort of a DevSecOps model, I don't necessarily like that term. I think DevOps is enough. I mean, we don't need, who else is going to get added into that list eventually? So DevOps is cool. But if you have a security expert in there, to an extent, I think it works. You might be able to have them work with the app gateway policies and everything and give them read-write capabilities to those policies, but there does need to be a delineation between responsibility once it finally comes to, say, pre-prod or production. And those changes should probably still need a human to okay them. I mean, much like, when you're checking in code and you have somebody else that looks over your shoulder to make sure you didn't make any mistakes. Same thing in the security realm. I think but you have to have that expertise first, or someone willing to learn within your group before you can really handle that. And that's why I often say, like I was stressing here, is if there's a vulnerability, have the security person show you how they can reproduce the example, because it's useful to see what tools I use as opposed to what you as a developer use. And sometimes there's a lot of similarities between the two.
Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the questions. Anyone else? Do you have any?
I don't
Okay. Oh, no worries. Well, thank you for joining me today. I really enjoyed it.